All right, so let's look at the elements of poetry, okay? This will kind of start you off on poetry. So, first of all, let's look at what is poetry. In one of the famous handbooks of literature, Holman, he defines poetry as this: a term applied to the many forms in which human beings have given rhythmic expression to their most intense perception of the world, themselves, and the relation of the two. The first characteristic of poetry, from the standpoint of form, is rhythm. True, good prose has more or less conscious rhythm, but the rhythm of poetry is marked by regularity far surpassing that of prose. In fact, one of the chief rewards of reading poetry is satisfaction that comes from finding variety in uniformity, a shifting of rhythm that nonetheless returns to the basic pattern. The ear recognizes the existence of recurring accents at stated intervals and recognizes too variations from those patterns. Whatever the pattern is, there is, even in free verse, a recurrence more regular than in prose. Frequently, rhythm affords an obvious difference by which one may distinguish poetry from prose. Inversion is rather more justified in poetry than in prose because most poetry is relatively short. It is likely to be characterized by compactness, unity, and climactic order. A vital element in poetry is its concreteness. Poetry insists on the specific, the concrete, and the bodily. So, poetry's main principle is rhythm. All poetry must have this, but various ways a poet may use rhythm makes poetry one of the most original and confusing forms of literature. Poetry must be read with more care and attention than prose because the poet must utilize every word and every pause towards his poetic goal. I suggest when you first approach a poem, just read it out loud, slowly and quietly. Let your ear absorb the raw emotions the poet is expressing. After all, poetry is emotional. After you've read the poem through, then go back with pen in hand and make comments and questions. I sometimes find it useful to rewrite the poem in prose so I can better see how the punctuation is used. So, for example, let's look at the death of the Bull Turret Gunner, which is quite different in prose. So here it is in poetry. From my mother's sleep I fell into the sate, and I hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. 6 miles from earth, loosed from its dream of life, I woke to black flak and the nightmare fighters. When I died, they washed me out of the torrent with a hose. So this is just one stanza of the poem. But let's look at it when we create it in sentence form. Oh, wait, I missed it. So let's look at it in sentence form. And you can see here, it's every 2 lines that have a period. And you can see we don't always have proper punctuation. So it should be when I died, comma, they washed me out. So again, the punctuation and the way it's set up is very different. This isn't the way the poem looks like naturally. This is me putting one sentence at a time. You can see here where some of this should be separated into different lines. So when reading a poem, be careful to read the punctuation correctly. Don't pause at the end of the line, but rather at a period or comma. The rhythm will be much easier to understand. All right, so words, which is the building block of poetry. The choice of diction could be specific versus concrete, specific concrete versus general abstract. So specific concrete words are usually associated with prose fiction. An author wants as much detail as possible so that his or her reader can visualize the story. However, sometimes that is the aim of the poet, but many poets also want to use general abstract words to express feelings or vague emotions to the reader. Levels of diction. We have high formal diction. This is diction which is elevated beyond what normal people would speak. Shakespeare wouldn't be considered elevated for his time. However, if someone wrote a poem today in Shakespearean diction, we would consider that to be elevated or formal. Middle or neutral. This is the language of the common man, which Wordsworth espoused. Many poems are written in this diction. And then low or informal. This diction is typically filled with slang and may be ungrammatical. Poets choose low diction for specific reasons, so be aware of why the poem is written in this manner. Special types of diction. An idiom, idioms are most idioms are so common we're not even aware of their presence. For example, it was dark is an idiomatic phrase. Idioms add a touch of realism to the work. Unusual or ungrammatical idioms may have significance and should be given special attention. It is dark is idiomatic because we wouldn't use it that way. Typically, it reflects the noun in front of the pronoun. But when we use it in the beginning of the sentence for it was dark or it was raining, we really kind of mean the light was dark, the outside was dark, or the outside was rainy. We don't necessarily want to use an it. It's just common in our speaking. So we use it in writing as an idiomatic phrase. Dialect, again, this adds to realism to the poem. It may give the poem a special rhythm as well. We see this especially if we're writing a poem that may be reflecting a certain culture. For example, rap poems often have dialect in them, and they use them for rhythmic purposes. Slang. A poem may want to add realism. A poet may want to add realism, or he or she may want, as our writers, to analyze the slang's meaning. Slang also works well in the economy of poetry by bringing more meaning to the words. We often use a slang word to represent a phrase or a greater meaning. So it can shorten a longer piece into a one-word situation. Jargon, once again, the poet is drawing attention to meaning and uses of word. However, the effect, whether comical or jarring, may be the poet's ultimate goal in his or her use of jargon. Syntax. Syntax refers to how words are organized. In English, we have a very specific word orders. In fact, there are just 7 types of word orders. Like, for example, a declarative sentence is noun, verb, noun, and an interrogative sentence is verb, noun, noun. Other languages, because they use suffixes more regularly, have varying word order. Our mind, however, is trained to the English word order. Thus, when you see eat dog bone, you begin to rearrange the sentence in your head. However, some sentence order can bring confusion, which the poet may use. For example, what is happening in this sentence? The woman gave her dog bones. Is the woman giving bones to her dog? Or is the woman giving some unnamed woman dog bones? Poets use strange syntax to bring attention to a part of the poem, or to explore a different rhythm, or sometimes to make you kind of choose your own conclusion. E.E. Cummings is famous for these type of playing with syntax, as we'll see in one of the Cummings poems we're reading this week. Here's a E.E. Cummings poem to practice on. This is very unusual syntax, but we're going to go through it. Next to, of course, God, America, I love you, land of the pilgrims, and so forth. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early, my country 'tis of centuries come and go, and are no more. What of it? We should worry in every language, even deaf and dumb. Thy sons acclaim your glorious name. Gory by Jingo, by G, by Josh, by Gum. Why talk of beauty? What could be more beautiful than these heroic happy dead who rushed like lions to the roaring slaughter? They did not stop to think, they died instead. Then shall the voice of liberty be mute. He spoke and drank rapidly a glass of water. So let's look at what's going on here. Next, of course, God, America, I love you. So notice here he's starting with this making fun, poking fun at the typical patriotic speech where we talk about God and we love America, every politician's speech. Then he's mixing all of these patriotic songs. You have here, Land of the Pilgrim's Pride, so forth. Say, can you see by the dawns? Oh, my country, 'tis of thee. Centuries come and go, and no more of what we should worry. What should we worry? In every language, even deaf and dumb. And deaf and dumb is like one word. Again, thy sons acclaim your glorious name. There's kind of that Christian reference again. Then we get into some of these slang terms. Gory, by jingo, by gee, by gosh, by gum. You know, kind of just doing that rapid slang in there. You know, by jingo. Have you guys seen the speech where President Trump goes bing bong boom? It's that kind of a situation. And again, then we're moving into this odd thing about kind of poking fun at the way politicians talk about soldiers. These heroic happy dead. Think about that. Heroic happy dead. Rush like lions to the roaring slaughter. They did not stop to think, they died instead. Then shall the voice of liberty be mute. So it ends with a question mark. But where does the question begin? Is it the who? No, it's the why. Why talk of beauty? What could be more beautiful than these heroic happy dead? And to make sure that we understand this is all a satire on a politics speech, he spoke and drank rapidly a glass of water. So E. Cummings wants you to realize this whole poem is just making fun of pushing kind of together the highlights of your typical patriotic speech making. So again, the poem uses little punctuation or definite word order, yet we can understand what's being said. In fact, isn't the poet saying something about the rhetoric of politicians? And don't I say something about bad typing? So denotation and connotation. Much of the poet's power comes from the poet's mastery of denotation and connotation. These are both important because when you're using as few words as possible, you need to make sure your reader can think about what their direct meaning is and what their associated meaning is. So words can be richly filled with so many overtones that word choice can completely change the tone of a poem. All right, so we're going to look at some of this week's poems.